preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Good morning. Our speaker has been writing, editing, reading, lecturing, doing research on science and medicine for at least 20 years, and I would vouch if it was a little more. But this is no ordinary writing, talking, research. Indeed, he's won 2 Emmy Awards for his contributions in these areas. One for the CBS News series on drugs, and the other, and another, I don't think this is the Emmy Award, this is another award, the New York State Press Broadcasters Award for individual reporting in '69 and in '70. He's been science editor at CBS for 6 years, and before that, for 13 years, he was science editor at the New York Herald Tribune. He was in on the first report of the Salk polio vaccine and attended for the Tribune the Geneva Atoms for Peace Conference and reported on these. He's written books for children on science, and somewhat off the track, he's edited a Russian encyclopedia. I present with great pleasure Earl Ubell.
You'll have to forgive me this morning. I have a recrudescence of an early winter cold, and if I stop and cough once in a while, you'll know that the disease care delivery system has done nothing for me. What I thought a great deal about, somebody I know just entered the room. I thought a great deal about what I would say this morning to an audience of women about medicine, and the more I thought about it, I wondered what there was that one can specifically separate men from women on. The thing that occurred to me right away was that women live longer than men by about 6 or 7 years. They go to physicians more. They have access to the disease care delivery system more than men. They use it more. It turns out that the disease rate among women is somewhat lower than that of men. And women's diseases, as compared to men's diseases, are a matter of organ rather than any specific thing related to women qua women. And when I thought about it, the only thing that was really different, fundamentally, is that women give birth and men do not, and that's a fundamental difference that I don't want to, put down in any way. But a fantastic thing has happened in relation to that in the last 100 years, if you look at it. That is, the maternal mortality rate, deaths among women from giving birth, used to be, about 100 years ago, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 per 100,000. That is about 1 or 2% would die in childbirth, and now that number is down to about 10 per 100,000, 1 in 10,000, less fraction of 1%. And no disease of men that I can think of, that is no catastrophe of men that I can think of, has had that fantastic decline. So as I look it over, it seems to me that women have done enormously better than men in dealing with the disease care system and diseases and illnesses. And that's shown by the fact that the longevity, that is, the longevity of women in the last 50 years has improved like 50% better than that of men. So what I thought about was that we're all in the same bag. That is, men and women maybe are together in relation to the disease care system, have some problems which we should face together and not separately. Now there's been a lot of talk about women getting the short end of the stick in this whole medical care system, but I really don't think so. I think that men and women together face a problem with respect to health. Now, you notice I kept saying the disease care delivery system, because that's what we have in the United States. We don't have a health system, and that's what I'm going to prove today. What we really have is a medical apparatus which is designed specifically to take care of you once you're sick. That part of the system which is designed to prevent illness is dying and is getting less and less important at a time when it should be becoming more and more important. And I was told this morning that this audience is a pretty tough one, that you want to deal with strong issues, and I hope that at the end you will feel that I've dealt with that rather than tell you, in a sense, funny stories about doctors and nurses. So, as an introduction to that, I have to say that a lot of what I'm going to talk about has to do with numbers. That is, what do we know in numerical terms about this whole disease problem? And for that, I'd like to point out that I have a very old-fashioned view with respect to that. There was a scientist, a physicist by the name of Lord Kelvin, who said the following, 19th century: when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, you have scarcely advanced to the stage of science, whatever else you may have done. So I'm going to really try to deal in numbers, and I discovered only yesterday, incidentally, that girls do better than boys in arithmetic, so I have no compunction about dealing with numbers this morning. Well, as I look over this whole disease care system, what I have discovered is essentially that we don't have too little medical care in the United States. Essentially, we have too much. And too much of it is delivered too late. And that's what I'm going to try to prove. And you'll see what I mean by that when we get to it. Right now, we're spending in this country something between $80 and $90 billion a year on this disease care system. That includes doctors, nurses, hospitals, drugs, whatever that is designed to take care of you when you're sick. Now, presumably, this system, this $90 billion, which incidentally is about $500, $450 per person in the United States, man, woman, and child, is supposed to increase our longevity and make us less sick. Well, it's very hard to detect that. As a matter of fact, with the advent of Medicare and Medicaid, which was a big explosion in this whole disease care system, Medicare was supposed to take care of the medical bills of old people, and Medicaid was supposed to take care of the medical bills of poor people. And I looked very carefully for an increase in longevity, that is, people living longer or people being less sick because of it, and indeed, you can't find it. Very difficult to find among old people any increase in how long they live as a result of the advent of Medicare. So the issue that we have to come to is that if you're going to direct your attention to taking care of illness once illness strikes, you're really there a little bit too late. And the reason, just have to stop and think for a minute why that's so. Of the average person who comes, of the average 100 people who come in contact with doctors, nurses, hospitals, and so on, it turns out that about a third of them have symptoms for which there is really nothing that this disease care system can do anything about. For example, take my cold. I have a cold, and there's really nothing that can be done about it. You can give me a little antihistamine, and maybe if you believe Linus Pauling, you might take gobs of vitamin C, but essentially nothing that the disease care system can do will reduce the cold or my displeasure with it. And furthermore, there are all sorts of psychic symptomology for which essentially the disease care system is unprepared to deal. About 2/3 have real symptoms of disease. That is, they have real, referable pains and other symptoms, blood pressure, whatever. And of that group, 2/3, about half, which is another third of the whole group, of the whole bunch, another 30, the disease care system can do nothing to ameliorate either. And here I merely have to point to things like cancer, for which really, ultimately, basically, despite what the American Cancer Society says, very little can be done. And I'll go into that a little bit later. Or chronic heart disease, about which very little can be done, to increase life expectancy or to decrease the disease state in any particular way. So that there's another third, that final third, for which the disease care system can do very well. Infections, if you've got an infection and you get a shot of penicillin, it works very well. Broken bones, certain kinds of disabilities, can do very well in that. But it's that middle third for which we spend most of our money. That is, those illnesses like heart disease and cancer and the debilities of old age, for which the disease care system can do very little to either increase life expectancy or decrease disability. And I think that can be demonstrated. So what can you do? I mean, here we have this tremendous apparatus of doctors and nurses and betatrons, and you have to go to a hospital to see these things. I mean, they're really quite elegant. And I say that very little has happened in the last 20 or 25 years as a result of that investment. There's some people who will take exception, but I think as I come along, I think you'll see what I'm trying to get at. Well, what should we do? I think we have to, if we're going to do anything, and here you and I, that is men and women, are in the same bag. If we're going to do anything, we have to go to prevention of disease. Now, I found a quote from 2500 BC. Chinese said it, of course. And it says this: it's to administer medicine after disease has struck is like trying to dig a well when you're thirsty for the water. That's 2,500 years ago, and in that 2,500 years, except for one glorious period in the last century and the beginning of this, we've done nothing but pay lip service to prevention. And if that's so, then all the organ transplants that we have, the coronary care units, things of that kind, are really tremendous irony. Because once disease has struck, the major damage has already been done. The major damage has already been done, and the physician is really ultimately powerless to reverse that. Now, that's a very unhappy state of affairs, because most of us, when we're sick, when we have a heart pain or chest pain, we run like hell to that doctor because we're sick. And it's hard to realize that ultimately so little can be done. And I'll try to demonstrate that again. So, I read with great amusement this morning that Mr. McGovern, who's running for president, says what we need is to outfit our ambulances with coronary care units, essentially, because so many people die on the streets of coronary care, and we could save, I forget how many lives he said, several thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives, by putting things in the ambulances so when the guy collapses on the street, you can give him some injection or whatever, or resuscitate him and get him into the hospital and save his life. And I think I can show that that's part of just building up this medical apparatus even more. Well, the usual answer to what I'm saying here is, well, for goodness sake, look at the Vietnam War. We're spending $90 billion a year on defense. Why don't we just take that money, $90 billion a year, and add it to the $90 billion we're already spending, and we have $180 billion, and then we can make this disease care apparatus system so beautiful that no matter what happens to you, the miracles of science can work, and they can rescue you from the jaws of death. The trouble with that is that dollars mean people. It means doctors, it means intelligent people who are capable with talent of applying the knowledge which is gained to lots of other people. And I happen to think that if one were to develop that disease care system by putting the Vietnam $90 billion into it, number one, you would not necessarily have all the people that you need, but you would divert people from other parts of the intellectual community, which supports the community in a way that provides us with better health. In other words, we would be robbing the better health area, and I'm going to come to that again in a minute too. So when you think of diverting dollars to this disease care system, just think of a great big hole in the ground in which you're shoveling money in and you don't know where it's going. And I'm going to try to prove that. Now the first thing I want to say is that in this country and at this time, I think we're rapidly approaching a really catastrophic crisis with respect to the disease care system, because the cost for it is escalating at an absolutely incredible rate. And now I'll give you some numbers. In 1929, just before the crash, it's a nice year, we spent in this country about $3.5 billion on this disease care system. That turned out to be about $35 a year per person. 1972, the number is up around 90 billion. People will argue that it's 75 or 80, but it's probably around 90. And that turns out to be $450 to about $500 per person. Well, that's over a tenfold increase. That's 12 times. That increase, about 1/3 of it was due to inflation. Just, the dollars are worth less. 1/3 is just simply the greater cost of doing business in the United States. In hospitals, hospitals are getting more people and so on. And 1/3 is a real increase in service. That is, they do more for you in hospitals than they used to, even though it sometimes doesn't seem so when you go there. But there's a lot more being done. And although people have argued that you can make hospitals as efficient as the Waldorf Astoria and cut down the cost per day, you probably could do that to some extent, but it would not really reduce it dramatically, maybe 15 or 20%. And that's one time only, and after that, I think the escalation would go up. Now, just a few years ago, in 1960 or 61, the increase per year was compounding about 8 or 9% a year. That is, the cost was going up 8% a year compounded. And that meant that by 1972, I estimated, the average cost in a hospital would be about $100 a day. My God, when somebody said $100 a day in 1960, they said, you're crazy, because then it was around 40. Well, today it's around 120, and in the big hospitals, not the small ones, but in the big hospitals, about 120. And the reason for that is that after the introduction of Medicare and Medicaid, the compounding rate went up by about 15% a year. It's leveled off a little bit now, but it's still going at around 10 or 12. So that means that by 1978, the average care in New York or Cornell or Mount Sinai or Columbia or something like that will go up to around $400 a day, which means that, when I said 100 in 1960, I heard the same giggle in the audience, by the way. So when I say 400 now, and you're giggling, I'm not quite as happy about it. But anyhow, at $400 a day, I computed that a 6-week coronary heart attack in a hospital like New York or whatever would cost $16,800. When you think that the bills now for the same thing are around $4,000 and $5,000, $16,000 doesn't sound like an outlandish thing. Well, for people like myself who bought a major medical policy in all good conscience for $10,000, that won't even cover my coronary attack a few years from now. So the second question that one has to direct itself to is that since we're going to this catastrophe to $400 a day and maybe beyond, what are we getting for it? Well, remember I said longevity is a very key issue. In other words, how long are people living? And although some people would seem to say that long life is not necessarily the end need that we have, that the quality of life is just as important, I think I'll try to show you that the long life and the quality of life are inexorably connected in a particular way. But let's look at long life first. In 1900, a white male baby had a life expectancy of about 48.2 years. That meant that he had a 50-50 chance of living to that age. In 1972, that white male baby has an expectancy of living to about 68 years. So that's a tremendous gain in life expectancy. That's 20 years. And the doctors and the nurses and the whole disease care apparatus, terrific job we did, fellas. However, if you look at somebody who's 55 years old, in 1900 he had a life expectancy of 72. Today, in 1972, his life expectancy is 74, which is a gain of only 2 years. Now let me put those numbers on the board, which is kind of interesting. 1900, this is a baby, 48. 1972, 68. This is males. Same thing for women, only women did much better. And this is a 55-year-old man, 72, 74. So since 1900, things have been made better for the 55-year-old by only 2 years. Now, when you consider that something like a third of our whole disease care apparatus is concerned with people this age and over, and this is what's been gained in 72 years of this kind of effort, that a large part of this whole disease program that we have is really seems to be foundering on some kind of illusion. This increase, by the way, was accounted for by the enormous reduction in infant and childhood mortality, by the reduction of infectious diseases. And incidentally, that occurred long before the discovery of penicillin. So that what we're dealing with is that if you're over 45, literally, the disease care apparatus system that we have here has quite very little to give you, as shown by this modest increase in longevity, and as shown by many, many other factors. Now, if you have an infection, it's fine. Good luck. You're really going to do very well. But if you have cancer or chronic heart disease, the things that really kill, that account for 3/4 of the deaths in this country, not so good. Now, what about prevention? Now, let me come back to the core of what I'm trying to say. The usual and popular mythic response is, preventive medicine, right? Preventive medicine, and you hear a lot about that today. It's sometimes called community medicine, but they really mean the same thing. It means really getting the disease early and finding it and do something about it so that you can prevent the debilitating effects of it as you go on. Well, let me just discuss that a little bit. The most popular method that physicians will recommend is case finding. In other words, find the disease early and get that person to a doctor to be treated so you can stop the disease. And the most common, one that would be most interesting to you, I would suggest, is that case finding in cervical cancer. That is cancer of the uterine cervix. Everybody in this room, I presume, knows what the pap smear is, that you take a little sample of vaginal fluid and examine it microscopically to determine if any cancer cells have been shed or abnormal cells have been shed from the uterine cervix. And the idea is that if you do this early enough and then take some preventive measure, usually a hysterectomy, then you can prevent cancer of the cervix. And indeed, the death rate from cancer of the cervix, sorry, I've forgotten the number, but it looks like this. This is 1972, and this is about 1920. It's really gone very sharply down. One of the most rapidly declining cancers in the world. Well, not long ago, Dr. Kyler Hammond, who did a study of this situation, discovered that if you haven't got a uterus, you can't have cancer of the uterus, which means that there's a very small rate of cancer of the uterus in men. But in women, a little slow, but it's less than a joke in women because, you know, it's a serious disease. And what he found out is that a very large number of women were having hysterectomies in this country for non-cancer reasons. Now, the reasons were usually excessive bleeding or polyps or a number of other things, but not for cancer or not based on the pap smear. And that if you now remove those women from the denominator, you see, when you have a rate, you have the number of cases divided by the number of people at risk. Well, if this contains all women, including those who've already had their uteruses removed, then the rate is going to be lower than if it only includes those women with uteruses, or uteri. And what he found out is if you take them out of this, if you take the women without uteruses out of this denominator, then the rate, and then the rate doesn't go down like this, but it's sort of like that. Not quite, it's going down, but something like that. And that he discovered also that for women 50 years old and over, if I remember the numbers correctly, something like a quarter of them do not have uteruses, and that the rate of hysterectomy was going up quite rapidly, so that he figured that by 1978 or 9, something like that, something like half of them would not have uteruses. So what was the pap smear doing in all this? First of all, the pap smear itself didn't even come into being before 1946, and already this was happening. So what was happening, I believe, very strongly, is that doctors were removing uteruses in women for mostly valid reasons. Some of them were for Blue Cross reasons, but mostly for valid reasons. What I mean by that is that hysterectomy is an easy way for certain doctors to make a buck, and they have made it in the past. It's somewhat less true now, but nevertheless continues. The hysterectomy rate continues to be very high. And when this was done, it turned out that they were doing it in women whom Dr. Hammond found had symptoms which were not cancer symptoms, but if the hysterectomy was not done, that at some future date these women were more at risk for cancer. So the physicians, unbeknownst to them, were doing preventive hysterectomies. Now, again, so that case finding as such really didn't do very much for this situation, I believe. Now, the other thing which I have to point out to you, which, again, with numbers, is that there is another cancer whose death rate is declining even more rapidly than that of cancer of the uterus. I have to introduce one more thing, by the way. One of the reasons for this decline given by physicians is that the cure rate for cancer of the uterus is very high, they say, 50%, something like that. Okay? That's one of the reasons. So that what they were saying is we were getting more cancers earlier and we were operating earlier, and therefore we were curing more women. There's another cancer that's declining even more rapidly than cancer of the uterus, and that's cancer of the stomach. And the cure rate for cancer of the stomach is not 50%, it's 5%. So you're left with a puzzle here. I mean, if the doctors claim credit for this one, how can they claim credit for that one? Nobody knows why this is happening, by the way. That's a big mystery. So much for case finding. Now, the other thing which is said is that if you treat diseases, you'll be able to reduce the death rate. I think I've shown you that maybe it isn't so in cancer of the uterus, and now I want to show you that it isn't so in tuberculosis. In 1900, I might as well keep this chart, the death rate from tuberculosis, TB, was 180 per 100,000. Today, it's about 5 and going down. Well, it's sort of level. Now, the question that you ask about this is, wow, from 180 to 5. Certainly, the disease care system must have done something for tuberculosis. But if you look at the graph, it looks like this. 180 is up here, and 5 is down here, and this is 1900 about, and it looks like this. Now, and this is where we are today, 1972. Can anybody guess what that is? That's streptomycin. In other words, this was about, in 1940, it was about, this number here is about 30. By 1940, most of the tuberculosis had been, kind of disappeared. And it had nothing to do with the disease care system, because the number of sanitariums you had, the number of treatments you had were quite small. I think it had to do with tremendous social changes which were taking place in this country. There was less crowding. People were not living together in such great density. There were other controls on general health. The food supply improved and so on. It's hard to prove, but I think that's what happened. So now I'll give you the statement that every epidemiologist knows, but very few physicians do, and that is this. Very simple. Cure never controlled a disease in a population. I've challenged physicians, when I've given talks like this, to name one. Pneumonia isn't controlled in the population. There are 50 to 60,000 deaths in pneumonia a year, maybe more. It depends upon how you count it. Is VD controlled by an absolute cure? Penicillin? It's not controlled. Never that I know. Now, there is one disease that is controlled in a population by cure. And you probably will think of it if you're old enough. I can think of it because my brother had it, and that is mastoiditis. Anybody who's my age and older, a little bit younger even, 40 and older, knows somebody who had the mastoid bone removed. But after penicillin, I don't think there's a soul, well, maybe there is a soul somewhere, who's had that done. So that's one. But it's so rare that you have to really think about it, and it turns out that it's a disease which is susceptible for peculiar reasons for prevention. Because today, when a physician deals with a kid who has any kind of upper respiratory disease that he knows is not a virus, in goes the penicillin or some other cillin, and very fast. So the rate of middle ear infection has gone way down. But in general, cure never controlled a disease, even when the cure is an absolute one. So, what should you do about this? The next item for preventive medicine is, let's take care of the people earlier and earlier in the onset of the disease. Like McGovern says, let's put the coronary care units inside the ambulances, essentially. Well, if you do that, you're going to spend something like $200 or $300 million a year in this country, in every hospital in the United States. It's just to support a coronary care unit, to say nothing of the capital investment, which probably would be of the order of $1 billion. And the studies that I have seen on coronary care units, where they put the monitors on and you see the in, the television things that even I've done, beep, 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 take care. Well, anyway, the studies I have seen, something like 15% of the people who are in the coronary care units survive 6 weeks, 15% more survive 6 weeks compared to those who are in general beds. Now, that's the best study that I have seen. There are other studies that have been made that show no difference between general beds and coronary care units. And probably the reason for that is that half of the people who have a coronary attack die before they even get to the hospital. So that's, I guess, the basis of McGovern's idea that if you put it in the ambulance, you might reduce the rate. I won't bother you with the calculations, but even at the 15% level, your $200 million a year buys you less than a 6% improvement in the death rate among coronary people. It says very little in longevity, by the way, maybe of the order of months if you calculate it out, because 1 out of 5 of the people who get out of the coronary care unit will be dead in 2 years anyway, and many more than that. But you see, you're dealing with diseases which are inexorable. That's the problem. And that comes out to about $20,000 to $30,000 per life saved. And people will say, well, so what? Let's spend it. It is a rich country. Let's spend it. But I'm trying to tell you that that diverts attention and talent and resources from what is the real core of what we should be dealing with. And that is prevention. Suppose we put in the ounce of prevention that everybody talks about. In other words, a pound is, 16 ounces? So 1/16 of what we're spending on medical care in this country would come out to be about $5 or $6 billion. Incidentally, we're spending less than $1 billion on what might be called prevention in this country. And what would we do with that $6 billion if it were really appropriated? Well, what would we go after? I personally would go after things like cigarette smoking, obesity, and the sedentary life, because combined, they probably account for much of the middle years death rates, that is, of men particularly, and later of women with stroke and blood pressure problems. If we got people to stop smoking cigarettes alone by some application of public health, which I really don't know how to do that now, but let's suppose we could. The estimate is that you would add 8 years of life to every 25-year-old man who now smokes 2 packs a day. Now, that's a lot of men in this country, and that 8 years is a tremendous amount when you consider these numbers. For all men, in other words, if you made the denominator all men, smokers and non-smokers, which is what people like to do, then it's 4 years. In other words, or twice what we've gained in the last 72 years, just by reducing cigarette smoking to 0. Now, suppose we could some way or another control obesity in our country, again, through some public health measures, which I won't, again, is very difficult to deal with, but maybe we will in the question period. I estimate that would add another 2 years of longevity to both men and women. And maybe another year with exercise. In other words, if we get people moving around in our country and not sit on their duffs all day. Well, that adds up to about 7 years of added life expectancy, just by these measures. And that doesn't count. Incidentally, I'm only counting coronary disease here. I'm not counting things like stroke, which are also related to obesity and diet and cholesterol and all the things of that kind, nor kidney diseases, which are also related to that, nor in some measure cancer. After all, what we've obscured in this whole cigarette cancer thing is that cancer is a very small part of the cigarette picture. The death rate due to cigarettes and lung cancer, the death number is something like 50,000 a year. That's a big number. That's as many people as killed on the highways, and it would be nice to eliminate, but it's trivial, or small, not trivial, small, compared to the 500,000 people who die of coronary disease and the million people who die of cardiovascular diseases in general. Well, both of these are, which are related in some way to cigarette smoking, particularly this one. So, you know, you're really dealing with big numbers here. There are other things that you can do. Take venereal disease. Penicillin is available, and yet it is estimated that 1 woman in 10 who is sexually active probably has gonorrhea in this country. Now, that's an enormous number. And the reason is that we have emphasized in all, and that's pretty tough, I must say. And the reason is that we have emphasized in our country, again, treatment. We try all the venereal disease propaganda that I've looked at, with very small exceptions, are related not to the prevention of the disease, but to case finding. That is, if you have the following symptoms, if you have a sore on your penis, or if you have a sore on your vagina, go to a physician. If you have an exudate which you can't explain, go to a physician. That's essentially what it says. Well, the trouble in the female case is that the normal vaginal exudates vary with time and diet and other infections, are almost indistinguishable for many women between the exudate due to gonorrhea. So many women don't know when they have chronic gonorrhea. Just don't know it. And maybe if we got every woman in the United States systematically to go for bacterial examination, just the way we go, we're inviting them to go for pap smears, you could reduce that rate somewhat, but I don't think you could eliminate it. I think something has to be done in relation to prevention of these diseases. Now, I read that the Chinese have a way of doing this, and I'd be interested to go there and see how it's done. But so far, if you look at the venereal disease control units in this country and in this city, they are not related to they're not specifically designed to prevent the disease. I had a suggestion, which is not a bad one, and I think so. If we could get people to wash before and after sexual intercourse, then probably you could reduce prevention. You could reduce the disease quite dramatically in this country. But that's another problem. But it shows that if you maybe point attention to other parts of the health aspect rather than to the disease aspect, you may be able to do better. Now, another area where I think we could do a great deal is in the alcohol area. I don't know if it's recognized generally, but there are 9 million people in our country who are in trouble over alcohol. Now, I'm not calling them alcoholics. I'm just calling them people in trouble over alcohol. They've lost their job, they've gotten into trouble with their wives or husbands, they've been arrested, they're repeatedly drunk, and so on. 9 million people fall into that category. And I calculated, since if you take the people who are greatest at risk of getting into trouble are the heavy drinkers in our society, and that means people who take 2 or more drinks every day. That doesn't sound like a lot depending upon what audience you're talking to, but 2 or more drinks a day are heavy drinkers. That represents about 13% of the population, and 80% of that 13% get into trouble over alcohol. Now, I calculated all you had to do is reduce the recruitment into the heavy drinking group by about 10%, and you would reduce the 9 million people to 8 million. Now, you're dealing with 1 million people, 1 million people, simply by prevention of heavy drinking, 1 million people not in trouble over alcohol. If of these 1 million, approximately a third, 300,000, are what are normally defined as alcoholics, you would, by simply preventing heavy drinking, prevent 300,000 people from becoming alcoholic. If you were to treat people in order to get this result, in other words, prevent 300,000 people from becoming alcoholic by treatment, it means that, number one, you would have to treat 1 million alcoholics because the improvement rate is 1/3 after treatment, the best that I can, in other words, 1/3 of these people will improve with treatment or become dry or whatever the phraseology you want. And the average treatment costs $10,000, so you're dealing with what is this? Where am I? $100 billion to dry out, so to speak, 300,000 alcoholics. So you see, treatment is silly in this situation. And it is silly in other situations. So what we have to devote ourselves to, devote a good deal of our resources to, much more than we're devoting it to now, is to prevention and stop giving it lip service. Now, we have in this country a very serious problem with that. And now I get to the nut of it, so to speak. The problem is we have sick people who need care and who cry out for care. And we have organized ourselves to give that care, and it seems inhuman not to give care. To say, essentially, that you want to divert resources from that person who's got a coronary attack, in order to do some scheme about preventing some disease in some unnamed person. If it's my father, I want him to be in Mount Sinai Hospital, and I want him to be in that coronary care unit, and I don't give a damn about some unnamed person up there. That's a very acute ethical, political problem, because we've learned to react this way. And I'll give you just an anecdotal example, the first anecdote of the day and the last one. And that is, a friend of mine had a sister who had breast cancer. She had a mastectomy, and then, as often is the case, the cancer spread to other parts of her body, and he asked me who could take care of her. And I suggested a physician who could treat her with chemicals and presumably slow down the spread of the disease. And ultimately she died. And we were discussing it, and he said to me, he said, well, you know, George wasn't all that good, the doctor. I said, what do you mean he wasn't all that good? He said, well, he sort of gave up at the end. I said, what do you mean he gave up at the end? Well, there are some things that he didn't want to do. He didn't want to do A and B and C. Incidentally, this is a very sophisticated lawyer that I'm talking about, and knew a lot and could deal with the medical terminology and understood the biology of it, and he knew things that could be done. He said he didn't do A, B, and C. I said, well, A, B, and C are things which might have made your system much more uncomfortable and not added anything to her life, except maybe give her 1 chance in 10,000 of surviving for another year or so.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.